Now, I want to talk about the Reindeer aircraft itself. Not because the particulars of the design matter so much to the story, but because its place as a prestige project for British aviation, even in fiction, makes it an object of artistic license as to what a revolutionary aircraft of the time could look like. If you noticed on my videos the repeating slideshow of book covers for the novel, there's a fair bit of variation for how the reindeer might look in story, as far as the cover artists were concerned. And just a few years after Neville Shute's novel No Highway came out in 1948, its film adaptation No Highway in the Sky, that came out in 1951, showed a radically different design for the so-called reindeer. Apart from the fighter jet-like nose cone and the bulbous flight deck area, the most standout feature is the nonsensical biplane horizontal tailplanes. This strange tail shape effectively gets the spotlight as far as the fictional aircraft is concerned. It's completely recognizable and unorthodox, unlike any other aircraft tail in history. Seriously, no one has used this design since exactly one series of aircraft in World War I, and once in Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. What the oddness of the design does, essentially, is focus attention as to the central conceit of the story. This revolutionary-looking aircraft has a design flaw and structural weakness that our hero, the awkward and uncharismatic Mr. Honey, has to convince people not to fly before it's properly addressed. But I'm not writing this section just to analyze the presumptions of cover artists and movie prop makers. I too simply want to throw my hat into the ring and offer my own artistic license, as informed by some aeronautical engineering knowledge, as to what would make a good, sensible, and beautiful aircraft as a Rutland reindeer. There's not a lot of specific technical data presented in story. After all, that would be beside the point. But here's what I could glean from the text. The Rutland Reindeer is a multi-engine passenger aircraft, large enough to hold fuel fit to cross the Atlantic non-stop from London, England, in Britain, to Gander, Newfoundland, in Canada, a minimum of 3,784 kilometers or 2,365 miles via a Great Circle route. At the end of such a flight, the aircraft is stated to be at about 72 tons of mass. That's equivalent to 72,000 kilograms or 144,000 pounds weight. That's heavier than a fully laden B-29 Superfortress. The weight is actually in the range of the 1960s aircraft Canadair CL-44, and also the same weight class as the Lockheed R-6V prototype airliners from 1946. As to the airframe, it has tricycle landing gear, which includes the nose gear Honey pulls up to ground the plane, which damages the wings and engines as well, close as they are to the ground. This indicates a low-mounted wing and either mid or low wing-mounted engines. As written in Dr. Scott's Trek of the Crash Site, the Reindeer has a number 3 propeller and a number 6 engine, which indicates that the Reindeer has 6 engines for propulsion. It's also implied when Honey suggests on his flight to shut off the inboard engines and cut the power to half for the middle engines, meaning that there are outboard engines as well. 6 engines for an aircraft are not the least bit crazy, although it was mostly an experimental idea at precisely the time the book was written. Secret projects for long-range bomber aircraft often included 6 engines, as an aircraft large enough for the fuel needed would require extra thrust, and a distribution of fuel consumption low enough to reach the ranges sought. There are reasons, however, that passenger aircraft, even those for long-range flights, have tended towards less engines, like twin engines, and not 4 or more like they used to. For now, though, let's move on to the fuselage. It's stated that the Reindeer has a pressurized cabin, which would be best served by a circular or at least ovoid cross-section, with one deck for passengers and an upper flight deck for the crew. This would indicate a fuselage arrangement roughly equivalent to the later real-life Boeing 747 in rough form. It's also stated, as pilot Samuelson demonstrates, that in the rear of the pressure cabin there is a porthole that allows someone to look directly at the spars of the horizontal tail. That's why the design cannot have biplane tailplanes, nor have the tail swept up and away from the cabin. Otherwise, the pilot couldn't take a dramatic look at the thing that might fail in flight and doom them all. I find the Stratocruiser example interesting because it transports passengers in a pressurized fuselage, with two decks holding the pressure in a double oval fuselage cross-section. Although the partial second deck is under the main deck, with the flight deck on the same level as, rather than placed atop a ladder from, the passengers. In my conception, the Reindeer would need a fuselage much more akin to a Boeing 747, as that aircraft's flight deck would be pronounced in its separation from the passenger deck, even if it wasn't conceived circa 1948. As for the wings, there's a couple of interesting options to implement. From the British side of aircraft design, the wing of the Vickers Victory Bomber, a secret project proposed by famed designer Barnes Wallis for Vickers Armstrong, would be a fitting design for a revolutionary British long-range aircraft. It could ostensibly fly a large six-engine aircraft and would draw upon the success of British four-engine bombers like the Avro Lancaster. From the American side, the height of aeronautical knowledge incorporated into wing design comes from the high-altitude, high-lift design wing from the B-29 Superfortress, the development of which costs more than the atomic bomb itself. The B-29's wing becomes the basis for high-performance multi-engine aircraft post-World War II, such as in the B-50 variant Superfortress, the C-97 Stratofreighter, and the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. Their wings were made for high-altitude long-range cruising. My conceptual Rutland Reindeer has the wings and tailplanes of the theoretical Type A Vickers Victory Bomber, what evokes the near-elliptical curves of the famous British Spitfire and Lancaster bomber. It also has the tall, curved, single vertical tail of the Superfortress and Stratofreighter cruiser aircraft. What makes them stable aircraft and perfect for passenger comfort, not to mention ease of pilot control. I'd like to imagine my Reindeer having 6 giant air-cooled radial engines, the reasons being that some of the most advanced power plants for multi-engine aircraft of the time were air-cooled radials. Those types of power plants were also the prime candidates for replacement when turbojets started to mature, because their increased maintenance for their increased power was becoming uneconomical, especially when turbojets could make the same thrust and power at high altitude with less material. It is that kind of technological development that an aircraft like the Reindeer would take part in, going from giant radial piston engines to turbojets as stated in story. I couldn't conceive of exact dimensions of fuselage length and width, nor wingspan and breadth, because it would depend on how many passengers the BOAC would want to transport per flight between its various routes and destinations. After all, what is closest to ideal an airline can get is to use aircraft on routes where passenger demand sees them near full seat capacity, i.e. transatlantic, and maybe a little extra for when demand surges from time to time. What does not help an airline is having routes where airplanes are flying with less and less passengers. This pushes changes in airframes, routes, and ticket prices. This is the section where we discuss how closely the economics of airline flight is connected to passenger aircraft design. There's no two ways about it. Flying is expensive, and designing and building a fleet of airplanes is also expensive and time-consuming. To be viable, never mind profitable, an airline wants to use their airplanes to transport the most possible passengers safely and timely. This requires understanding what destinations passengers want to travel to and how many can be accommodated. Depending on what passenger demand the airline can anticipate for a route, they may order aircraft of a given size and passenger capacity. How to pick a passenger aircraft? If it's too small, revenue from passengers not serviced can be lost to competitors with available empty seats. If it's too large, the operating and maintenance costs could overtake the maximum possible revenue from even a full flight. A shortage of seats or too great an aircraft for the passenger demand, both would push up ticket prices, which would make the airline less competitive compared to others. Outside of having the luck of a predictable passenger demand on a set of routes, and a passenger aircraft perfectly sized, one way airlines can get around the inconsistencies of demand and capacity is to organize their routes into a hub and spoke model, where the spokes use smaller aircraft to transport passengers from smaller airports to larger hub airports. And from the hub airport, a larger aircraft transports a greater passenger load on a trunk route to another hub airport, from which passengers can continue on in reverse as they wish. An airline might use one large aircraft for their trunk route and smaller aircraft for their spokes. Or two or more airlines can specialize along the hub and spoke. The smaller aircraft can be as flexible as the demand is elastic, and the aircraft flying trunk routes can be more consistently near full capacity. In the case of BOAC and the Reindeer 6-engine airliner, it appears that airline operates only the Reindeer, having explicitly retired their older models for the London-Gander transatlantic route. As stated in story, it's not really flexible when the Reindeers have to stop flights for a major safety modification, and there are no other aircraft to serve the demand in their absence. In a normal competitive market with viable alternative suppliers, another airline could take up the demand for transatlantic travel while BOAC is waylaid in Britain. However, thanks to the author's note, it suggested that BOAC is monopolistic in its services. Even if other airliners serve the regional spokes to BOAC's hub-to-hub trunk flight model, there are apparently no other airlines able to make transatlantic flights in the story's setting. Whether no other airlines can make that route, or are not allowed to, leaves the same result. A drop in service becomes a political prestige problem for the state-owned airline BOAC. As beautiful as a fictional aircraft like the Reindeer can be, there are still very particular reasons that modern passenger aircraft and airline services have converged onto very select designs and airline models. Engineering reasons and economic reasons. The purpose of airlines, whether for profit or for public service, is to match the costs of flying with the demand of prospective passengers. As glamorous as flying in large multi-engine aircraft with extensive onboard services seems, economics and engineering pushes aircraft designs the other way. Large four-engine aircraft are and have long been giving way to smaller twin-engine aircraft. Passengers per flight have also been shrinking, from hundreds upon hundreds on double-deck jumbo jets to around 200 as typical. And airline flight models have moved from hub and spoke to direct point-to-point flights. None of these changes is independent of the others. Twin-engine aircraft are far more common than 3- or 4-engine aircraft because turbofans have been developed to be so powerful and fuel-efficient that only 2 are needed, even for the longest flights. It's less components to acquire and upkeep, and their maintenance makes them reliable enough that such aircraft can journey even farther away from alternate airports and still make it safely in an emergency. With the ability to go farther on fewer engines, airframes don't need to haul so many passengers to make back their costs for an airline. They can be smaller and thus easier to acquire and upkeep, and take passengers directly between destinations, not just regionally, but also on transcontinental and transoceanic flights. No need to feed into a hub from a spoke. The smaller passenger capacity of newer aircraft is not a detriment to airlines or flying in general when they can be more full of paying passengers for more flights in the lifetime of the aircraft. In fact, you might have heard of an inverse problem that airlines sometimes overbook their flights, assuming a consistent number of passengers don't show, so that their flights can still fly at capacity, only to find, whoops, everyone showed, so someone has to get booted from the flight. It is indeed a far cry from passenger flying service as a novel, catered experience, where passenger comfort and service could make the experience fun, restful, and rejuvenating, rather than a draining, tedious slog. Indeed, that is the nature of flying for profit, where there is so much competition that the only marginal gains are to be made in cutting costs, i.e., in-flight catering, among others. There is some discourse on how flying can be changed for the better in the future, not just the impact on our environment and community, but also in the quality service that used to be enjoyed when airlines started to spread their wings, as it were. In this way, the Reindeer's Chronicle is a look into the past to see how a new frontier of travel was the beginning of wondrous possibilities for anyone who wanted to fly. It's a dream that's long been dormant thanks to political and economic influences. But I want to leave you with this note. There are ideas and attitudes, policies and designs that we can advocate for to improve the quality of air travel and thus help open up the world to us in that fantastic way that only a beautiful airplane like a magic flying reindeer can.